everyone, and thank you for joining Optimizing AWS Backup Spend, How to Identify and Automate Saving Opportunities. My name is Ilanit, and I'm the head of marketing at Wiv. So right before we're going to start our session, I just want to go over a few small housekeeping rules. So we strive to make this space as educational and as knowledgeable for everyone. So we encourage everyone to participate and send questions in the Q&A chat throughout this whole webinar, and we'll of course address them. Just make sure you are being respectful and mindful of everyone while you do that. And without further ado, I want to introduce our today's speakers. So we're joined by Gil Rozen, co-founder and CTO for Wiv.ai, and Sabith Venkit. I hope I'm pronouncing your last name correctly. He's a principal recovery resilience architect at AWS. And we're going to start with Sabith. So I'm going to turn over the mic to him. And once again, I encourage everyone to send your questions in the Q&A chat. We're going to leave time between the sessions and at the end, and we'll address everything. So Sabith, the stage is yours, and enjoy, everyone.
Thank you. All right, let me share my screen. Okay. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. Let's get started. Like I was introduced, my name is Sabith. I'm a principal solutions architect, part of the AWS Data Protection team, which in my day-to-day job, I have the privilege of working with larger AWS customers, helping them set up highly resilient recovery architectures using AWS Backup. So what we're going to do is today look at some of the ways in which customers misunderstand or overlook what AWS Backup implementations are, and then kind of tie it back into some of the capabilities that Jill is going to show us later during the session. I generally start with a quote from a famous person that you all could relate to. Werner Vogels is known to everyone, and he's a CTO of Amazon. But he has continuously reiterated the point that cost optimization is never a one-time effort. It's always a continuous effort. It's always about identifying where the wastages are and then helping automate the fixes for it so that it'll be iterative in nature. So it should never be considered as a one-time effort, and then you'll have to always look at as a relentless pursuit, so that you would continuously optimize and then channel all of the savings into more business productive activities. Let's start by going through some of the data protection fundamentals. This might be quite fundamental in nature, but it is always good to set the stage properly so that we can work on a proper foundation. Backup is an opportunity, in my perspective, for any organization to be prepared for a recovery. So backups generally are useful when you would want to recover. So it's actually your backup of responding to a particular event. This event could be various in nature, but generally, whenever we talk about backups, at least from in the cloud space, there is two types of backups that customers refer to or users refer to. One is what we call the full backup, which is generally capturing the current state of a data source. This could be any data source that you have your production data stored in. And after that particular initial snap of the data, which is the full backup, if you are capturing the changes that has happened from a particular reference point, these are incremental in nature. Sometimes the underlying data source support a full backup and an incremental backup, and sometimes the resources only support a full backup, which means that every time that you do a backup, you might end up doing a full backup. This is a very critical differentiation for you to understand when you plan how a particular resource will be backed up and how long the backups will be kept and used for. Then there are a lot of factors that would impact the cost of any of these backups that you're trying to take. But I would want to probably categorize them into four different sections. One is what we call the how much and how often that you're trying to how often the original data source kind of changes their data, which is the rate of change of data. So if you have got an EBS volume in which you continuously write 10 meg of data on an hourly basis. So as you would know, every hour, if you were to capture the changes, that will be 10 meg in nature. But if the data only changes once in a day, probably all of your hourly backups will not capture the changes, and then you would only capture one large chunk towards one particular point of the day. So these all would be very impactful on the final cost. And then, like I was mentioning earlier, like supporting incremental backups and all those things, like, it will be very much important in this particular how much and how often category. The next classification would be how many. This would talk about, like, how many copies of the data that you're trying to keep. Beyond the actual storage charges, you would also then have to consider the network transfer charges if you were to keep the copies of data in two independent regions, for example, in AWS. So then you'll have to pay for the inter-region transfer charges, which is also one aspect of the cost. On top of this one, if you were to make copies of the data, you will have to also consider, for example, KMS operations, which is required to decrypt the data primarily on the source and then to re-encrypt when you're storing on the destination. And the third classification is actually how long. How long are you trying to store the data for? So, like I mentioned earlier, in the first classification of how often your data changes, and if you were to retain this data for, let's say, 14 days, you will end up paying a certain amount of data compared to retaining the same amount, same data with the same change rate for 31 days. You would end up paying for more storage because there is more changes that we are trying to capture. And then this also will kind of decide, like, how effectively you would be able to do a tiering of the storage, depending on whether the underlying storage service supports tiering. You might be required to retain the data in a warmer tier for longer duration. So as long as your data is being retained enough for such periods, you would be able to get the benefits of the tiering. And the fourth category is something that a lot of the users kind of overlook, which is actually the overhead of doing any backups. So if you're actually relying on a particular component like AWS config to perform a reporting, most of the time you would overlook the actual attributing charges, which are AWS config charges, for example. On the other hand, you might also have things like KMS operations, like, API calls on S3 buckets and all those things, which generally is actually the overhead required to perform the backup operations in this case. The next important thing that I would want to go through is the simple misconception that recovery is actually singular in nature. Most of the time, customers kind of port over while porting over the workloads from on-premises into cloud, they kind of port over their data protection requirements as well. But in my experience, I would say any customer who can differentiate the recovery aspects where your backup would be utilized will be quite mature in their journey. So any backups that you would use for operational recovery would be ideally different from an infrastructure recovery, which generally refers to a region becoming unavailable and all those things. But the most and the third misunderstood category of this one is the cyber recovery aspect of it, which is something that has been getting popular of late. So in the operational recovery aspect, we generally talk about anything that is non-malicious in nature, which is like simple enough, like fat finger errors, accidentally deleting a data file, accidentally deleting a table. You would then be able to go find a particular backup and then try to do a recovery. That's generally operational in nature. The same RPO concepts that you would apply for operational recovery cannot be applied for infrastructure recovery for simple enough reasons that if a region kind of becomes unavailable, and if you were to rely on a copy of the data in a different region, you would have to consider the expectations of restoring in the other region or having to move the data again back from the other region to the primary region after the source region has recovered and then try to restore. So there is actually additional overhead in terms of moving data or in terms of executing a particular recovery process in the destination region. So that's something that will differentiate your RTO for an operational recovery versus an infrastructure recovery. In the third category of recovery aspects, like in the cyber recovery, most of the time, because it is malicious in nature, which is triggering the recovery, there is a lot of overhead process required in the recovery process, wherein after the security operations center team kind of gives the overhead for you to do a recovery, you will have to understand the context in which the recovery is done. Whether you're doing an in-place recovery, you're doing a recovery in a different account, entirely different identity domain, and all those things. The primary important step required in this cyber recovery is the validation process. In no situation, any customer trying to do a recovery for cyber situations is not expecting to reinfect the environment with the malicious kind of payloads that you would have in the original workload. So the most important step in this entire process is the validation. Then comes the most general industry standard numbers that we get to talk about when discussing backups, which is the 32110. The number three would have different meanings depending on how would you strategize your backups. But generally, whenever we discuss with our customers, we kind of talk about keeping at least two additional copies of your data in addition to your production workloads. Two of them kept in different logical boundaries, and in the case of AWS, we generally recommend keeping it in two different accounts, which is not bound by the same identity domain. If you have a requirement of recovering from regional unavailabilities, then one of these copies is recommended to be kept in a different region. It is recommended that, like, at least one of these copies is kept in an immutable vault wherein it is tamper resistant, and then any intent of trying to compromise the data is not allowed in this tamper resistant immutable vaults. But the most important number in this entire 32110 is the number zero, which means that you are actually continuously validating the restorability of the data, and there are zero validation or restore errors that when trying to utilize the backup data. Because any backup, how much ever number of copies that you would keep, which is never restored, which is never tested, is as good as not having any kind of backups. Then once we have come up with a proper backup strategy aligned to your data protection requirements and recovery contexts, the most important process is to apply the concepts of threat modeling. Generally, when we discuss with our customers, we take an example of the four-question framework that Shostak created, which is about understanding the threat vectors that could compromise your recovery, which is ensuring that you have a resilient recovery strategy in place. So you kind of look at what are the things, what is it that you would want to achieve, and what are the things that could go wrong against it, and what is it that you're trying to do to mitigate the threats in the scenario. And then it has to be a continuous evaluation process wherein you're continuously evaluating whether whatever you're trying to mitigate is indeed mitigating the threats that is put forward. And these are generally captured in a threat model document, and then any threats that you can't mitigate is registered in the risk register, so that, like, you will be able to understand that, okay, this is a threat that you don't have mitigation against. A simple example that you can consider in this entire exercise is the notion of a KMS key getting deleted when you are trying to think about this one. So any backups that is kept in an immutable vault, which is encrypted using a CMK, which was deleted, will mean that you're kind of having all of your backups in the most secure vault in the world with and having lost the keys to the vault. So a KMS key that is not accessible will effectively mean that you can't restore the backup because it has been encrypted, and then you don't have access to the keys. So that's one of the threat vectors that we kind of talk about in this scenario. Now that we have actually done a proper scoping of what it needs to be backed up, how what is the backup being used for, the recovery context and all those things, and applied the concepts of all the threat modeling and all those things, generally you would have had a properly right-sized backup strategy in place, which is the foundation of it. And as you can see in the representation, there is three different pillars that will kind of ensure that you've got a proper recovery in place. The first pillar, or the first leg in the three-legged stool, is actually the immutability and isolation. So as we have seen in the experience talking to customers and from the field and all the researchers, any attacker that would want to compromise your environment would ideally be compromising the recovery options as well. So one of the ways in which the recovery options could be compromised is by deleting your backups. So by ensuring that you're storing your backup in an immutable and isolated vault, you will be able to access them as required. The second most important pillar or the leg in this particular three-leg stool is the integrity pillar. So this is the pillar in which you are not just ensuring that you've got an immutable and isolated backup, but also the backup is integral in nature, which is tying back to the number zero that we have earlier. So this is to ensure that you scan your backups for any presence of malware strains or the actual impact of malware in the presence of encryptions and all those things to ensure you can find at least one last good known backup when you are required to restore. And the third most important pillar, I mean, all pillars are very important. As you can see, if one pillar does not function well, your entire recovery is broken. The availability leg or the availability pillar talks about ensuring the backups are not just immutable and isolated, not just integral, but also available in nature, as in when you're required to access the backups, that it is available. So, like I reiterated always, your backups are only as good as their recoverability. There might be reasons why you would do the backups, probably regulatory requirements, and somebody asks you to do a backup. But in my perspective, a backup should always tie back to the recoverability scenario that it has been attached to. Okay, now I would like to introduce a service that was launched 6+ years back in 2019 called AWS Backup. So AWS Backup is a service that was created to remove all the undifferentiated heavy lifting requirements from the customers in terms of maintaining custom solutions. And the best thing about AWS Backup is that it will allow you to work backwards from your data protection requirements that we talked about earlier in terms of what resources to backup, how often to backup, how long the backups to be kept for, how many copies of the data to be kept, and all those things in a simplified backup policy or plan. And then once you hand it over to AWS Backup, and AWS Backup will do all the undifferentiated heavy lifting. And AWS Backup is a service which supports most of the resources in natively in AWS today. As you can see, the number of workloads are actually increasing at a good pace. On top of the capabilities of supporting the underlying services, AWS Backup natively have got enough options to cover all the three pillars that we discussed earlier in the form of immutable vaults, which ensures that not even a root user could tamper your backups, and logically agap faults integrating with a multi-party approval capability, ensuring that you can access your backups even if your primary organization is compromised through integration of multi-party approval, and then restore testing with the integration with partner solutions like Elastio.com or natively from Amazon GuardDuty. You'd be able to scan your backups for any presence of malware or ransomware strains so that you would be able to ensure an integral backup in nature. And all of these things are kind of covered in a governance envelope called the AWS Backup Audit Manager, which allows you to perform both operational reporting and validations on the backups that you're trying to create. Okay, now that we have briefly looked at the service in terms of compressing all the concepts that generally takes a couple of hours to discuss into 20 minutes, let's look at a reference architecture that most of our customers today implement at scale. So as you can see here, there is what we call a workload account in which you would be running your production workloads, and a backup vault, a normal backup vault that will be provisioned locally in the workload account will generally get a copy, the first copy of the backup, which is for operational recovery purposes. So these are the backups which are done a bit more aggressively, like an 1 hour RPO kind of thing. And any backups that are kept for cyber recovery purposes, which will be a little more lenient RPO, probably the daily backups, which are sent to what we call the AWS Backup Logic Lake Vault. So AWS Backup Logic Lake Vault, in a nutshell, is the managed version of the normal AWS Backup Vault, wherein any copies of the data in the Logic Lake Vault will be stored in an AWS Backup Managed Vault, allowing both integration with resources like AWS Resource Access Manager or using an AWS owned key encryption, which means that you don't have to worry about the threat vector of the key being compromised and all those things. And like I mentioned earlier, if your threat vector stipulates that you need to have a copy of the backup data in a different region, you would be able to keep this copy of the data in a different normal backup vault in a different region. So if you're primarily operating out of US East 1, this third copy would ideally mean keeping a copy of the data in US East 2. And as you can see that AWS Backup Logic Layer Vault seamlessly integrates with Resource Access Manager, allowing you to share the contents of the Logic Layer Vault with a different account, like called the forensic account of your choice. So this could be a forensic account where you have deployed all of your forensics tools entirely operated in a new AWS organization like your security organization. And using partner solutions like Elastio, you would be able to scan the backups for any malware, ransomware with integration with restore testing. But you can also see that AWS Backup natively integrates with Amazon Guard Duty, which means that malware protection provided by Amazon Guard Duty will be available for scanning the backups for EBS and S3 resource types. And then if you were to follow the principles of least privilege, you have got delegated admin account and key vault account. And as you can see that this entire architecture will be complicated when you're operating this at scale. Like, we have customers who operate the workload account in tens or hundreds or even thousands. And if you were to operate this at scale, that's when the complications of identifying cost optimization opportunities and then operating upon it at scale come into play. So, like I was mentioning earlier, it is a continuous process that you would have to get through. So there is before, there is after, and there is actually continuous improvement on it. What Jill and in a session is gonna do is to probably look at some of the cost optimization opportunities that we talked about earlier, and how Viv as a platform will be able to execute these cost optimization opportunities at scale. So you would be able to probably run these optimization opportunities in a single account by vibe coding a script. But if you were to run it securely across tens or hundreds of accounts in a proper workflow kind of a scenario, that's where Viv as a partner kind of comes into play. And I will now hand it over to Viv to sorry, Jill, to walk us through um, the
Yeah. Thank you, Savi. Thank you for the great review of AWS Backup and also the cost. I will just share my screen. Okay, do you see my screen?
yeah.
Great. So, as you mentioned, Savi, and I want to touch the last, the last word, the continuously. I want to focus on it about how you do continuous optimization of AWS Backup. So, as mentioned, my name is Gil. I'm the co-founder and CTO of Wiv. I'm 7 years in the cloud and FinOps space. And just before we dive in, I want to have like a short brief of what Wiv is. So we see Wiv as the ultimate FinOps automation suite. For any manual process that you have on your organization, we can provide the full automation for it on scale on your different cloud environments. So in general, Wiv is structured from three things that are working together. On the left, we have the FinOps workflow automation, which you can create powerful, scalable automations using different flow controls like approval requests, conditions, and ask directly your cloud environment. On the right, you have the human approval and case management, as we see with the human in the loop inside automation is a very important concept to keep things really clear and really safe. And on the middle, we have our AI layer, which is basically our AI FinOps agent, Wivi, which is which sits on top of these layers and can communicate with the automations and do a really deep analysis on your cloud environment. So I'll quickly drop to the Wiv platform. Okay. So what we see here is, I think, let's say a traditional view for FinOps engineers, FinOps teams around the AWS backup. We have EBS idle snapshots. And the usual case is that these resources have some cost opportunities, in this case, idle snapshots. And the immediate question is, what do you do? And sometimes the answer is nothing, but actually it depends. And nothing because you can't operate on it on scale. You don't know who is the owner. You don't know what are the actions for it. But in Wiv, we want to provide you the tools to apply action upon it. So I can basically select some items from it and decide on the action. And I can archive the snapshots, or maybe I would terminate the snapshot, depend on, I don't know, if it's a dev environment, if it's a testing environment. Maybe they are really old snapshots that I could also report and just send them on Slack or on email. So let's say I want to terminate snapshots, and I will see the workflow that will be applied to it. And you can see, which is relatively simple. For each item, we delete the EBS snapshot. But what if I want to change something upon it? I can really quickly go into the workflow. And let's say I want to add an approval request for this part. I can easily add an approve step and add here the delete snapshot. So for each time I want to delete an EBS snapshot, an approval request will be sent on Slack or on Teams or on email, any channel that you need, and you will approve, or the corresponding owner will approve. So this is a use case that we separate the discovery and the remediation of the opportunity. But there are use cases that you can apply a governance. And for this, you might not have to do this separation. So one case for this is the Aurora snapshot export and cleanup. So in a really quick manner, Aurora snapshots can accumulate a lot and drain your AWS budget. And AWS has an out-of-the-box integration that export these snapshots directly to S3 as Parquet format. Then you can just delete the snapshot and really reduce the cost of it. So this workflow does the full process entirely. What does that mean? It means that it first retrieves the Aurora clusters, then iterates through each of the clusters snapshots, and then it checks if the threshold is exceeded. And the threshold is something that you will configure. What is the corresponding age for you that this snapshot should be exported to S3? And this could be some internal organization decision. This could be read from any other third party. You decide, and it's totally flexible for you. Once this threshold was exceeded, the workflow starts and the snapshot export starts to be activated. And once we check that the export status is completed, the snapshot is deleted. And we audit everything. So you could see that any export that was done would be audited into here. It's a internal database that Wiv provides. And finally, after the workflow finishes, we can prepare a summary report and send a full breakdown email of what happened. So for this, you can see that there are several layers of audit and also reporting. And when I'm saying continuous, when I've mentioned continuous, I want to go directly to the dashboard of this workflow. As you can see that each time the workflow runs, this process runs, you could see the total savings that are being accumulated and also the total snapshots. and the projected cost versus the actual cost. And you can see that this was decreased, of course, because we exported the snapshots and deleted them and not kept them as it is. So you have a live process that feeds itself in a really complete manner. And there's the saying, trust the process. So first, before you can trust the process, you gotta build it first. So for this use case, for this Aurora snapshot export use case, you can't just have some script or have some spreadsheet that you manually work for. You need to have like a full automated process that scales with your environment and provides you full audit and full visualization for it. So Wiv provides the tool for you to build it. And one last thing that I want to finish with is, what if we don't know exactly what we need to optimize? What if we don't know where to start? So for this, we have Wiv.ai, and I can ask Wiv.ai a very simple question. What's the one thing about our backup spend I should know that I probably don't? And I would click here, details. And this is a advanced question because I need to really understand my cloud environment and to understand the different backup costs. So because Wiv.ai sits on top of the automation engine, it will configure a get and cost and usage step. And I will go to a pre-made answer for it. So you could see already it's the same question. But you can see here the full answer that Wiv.ai provides, the hidden truth about your backup spend, and it provides a full analysis of the cost, the effect of backup retention, the different services that are inside the backup process, and also the relevant charts to understand the cost breakdown. And finally, Wiv.ai provides suggestions to move the conversation into action and also to act inside the session itself and to apply automation to it. So this is it from my side. Back to you, Sabith, for the closing.
Yeah, thank you. Let me share my screen one more time. And yes. So what are the key takeaways on this one? Obviously, like we reiterated at the start of the conversation, the backup architecture has to align to your recovery category. You can't have one size fits all for everything. And then it's always important to understand the cost levers, which is like, how much are you backing up, how many, how long, and the overhead as well. Like, these are things that you have to probably understand whenever trying to come up with a backup architecture. And then the most important thing, like Jill was like showcasing, is that understand how each service backup mechanism work, whether this underlying service supports a full versus an incremental backup. For example, in this case, if Aurora backup copy does not support an incremental copy operation, the best opportunity that you will have is to probably life cycle any of the longer retention backups into an Parquet format in S3, and then have it stored in a lower tier storage, and then have them deleted or life cycled out, like with a shorter retention. And then just how it was highlighted at the start of the conversation, cost optimization is a continuous process. So one thing that works today might not work tomorrow, or one thing that did not work yesterday might work today. So it all depends on how effectively the service is evolving, which AWS Backup is known for in a continuous way. So which means that, like, if there was a product that was not supported earlier and then it started supporting now, you probably will have to, take away some of the manual processing that you have done and then move over to a more native capability to reduce the cost. And the most important thing is to understand the pricing. And then if you're in need, obviously reach out to your AWS account team, or there are partners like Wiv.ai who are available to help you out in terms of looking and identifying the cost optimization opportunities at scale. I think the most important thing that I love about Viv's platform is that it allows you to execute these automation strategies at scale, like not just one account. Like you could suddenly have a single workflow created and then run across like hundreds or thousands of accounts, and then these optimization data brought together into a single dashboard that you can see and then kind of present it forward to your stakeholders, kind of thing. So that's where all of these things work. That's pretty much what you'll have to share. If there are questions, we'll be happy to take.
Yes, we actually have a few questions that were sent in during the chat. So I'm assuming this first question is to you, Sabith.
Yeah.
In customers' environments you have worked with, what is the most common misconception teams have about optimizing AWS backup spend?
The one example that I can think of right now is when you assume that a certain backup is of a size and without understanding how the incremental backups work. If you were to just go in and delete a few backup recovery points or the recovery points, it does not directly convert into probably cost savings. So it might be that these recovery points that you tried to purge does not actually hold any more incremental changes. They are probably very minimal incremental changes. And if you were to just clear them out and expect a lot of savings to happen, it might not really bring you the savings. So it's more about understanding which recovery point has got what amount of data in terms of looking at your data state and then change attributes and all those things, and kind of applying these optimizations. So one tool that could help you is one data source that could help you here is the cost and usage report data, which kind of tells you exactly how much each and every recovery point would be captured for example in the EBS snapshots, and then look at clearing them accordingly after analyzing the data.
Perfect, thank you. This next question actually, I think, connects to the previous one. Are there situations where teams optimize backup costs too aggressively and create risk they don't realize until recovery is needed?
Look, it could be various scenarios, but one common use case is that in the name of cost optimization there would be a more aggressive approach of life cycling all of the backups. So, for example, if you're doing a daily backup and keeping the backups for 14 days, and if your backup testing strategy does not test the backups at least once every 14 days, what it means is that you're aggressively life cycling your backups without ever having an opportunity to find one last good known backup. So I would say all of these things has to be aligned, like your backup timing, which is aligned to your RPO requirements, your life cycle requirements, and your validation has to come aligned, so that you don't aggressively life cycle out recovery points and end up like not having a proper backup to be able to allow you to restore.
Thank you. This next question is to Gil. Gil, if I'm a FinOps practitioner managing multiple AWS accounts, how would I prioritize which backup optimization opportunity to automate first?
So this is a very good question, as we often meet teams that don't know where to start and don't know what is the first automation that they need to do. And we usually recommend starting simple, as automation can be very complex and can do a lot of things. So we usually say, okay, let's see what are the low-hanging fruits, something that could provide you a good impact, but without too much effort into automation. As we know, sometimes automation can get challenging to get into. So this is what I would say. First, start with a simple automation that provides you good impact.
Perfect. And we have one last question. At what point do teams usually get stuck when trying to move from identifying a saving opportunity to actually taking action?
So usually, again, it connects to the automation part. It's the it's the remediation, it's the actual termination. And some teams tend to think that automation is I press the on button and that's it. The automation is going to delete all of my environment. And for this, we apply on Wiv a lot of a mechanism to ease this process with approvals, with a really rich views of understanding what the automations are doing and at what stage they are right now. And this reduces the stack effect and provide them more context and more understanding that allow them to act upon it.
Thank you. We don't have any more questions right now, but if